At a meeting in Washington, D.C. in 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt asked his commanders in China what they thought of Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek, who, as Generalissimo, was officially the commander-in-chief of Allied forces in China. "He's a vacillating, tricky, undependable old scoundrel who never keeps his word," replied General Joseph Stilwell, the overall American commander in China. But the general commanding the U.S. Army Air Forces in China told Roosevelt, "Sir, I think the Generalissimo is one of the 2 or 3 greatest military and political leaders in the world today. He has never broken a commitment or promise to me." That general was Claire Chennault. Welcome to the United States of Amnesia. We are the podcast that reminds us of what we have forgotten. It is often said that history repeats itself. Mark Twain allegedly said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. But over time, many topics have become clouded by biases and oversimplifications, or have become mythologized and now are misunderstood. Misunderstanding means learning the wrong lessons from history, perhaps, or even learning nothing at all. And that can leave us poorly prepared for history's next rhyme. In this episode, Mike again leads us in our narrative of how America continued to fall short of its goals for China in World War II during the second half of the war. We meet General Claire Chennault of Flying Tigers fame, whose ideas for how to fight in China contradict those of his bitter rival, General Joseph Stilwell, but gain favor with Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang, and at least for a while, with Franklin Roosevelt. Ultimately, the war in China ends in frustration for America, and we discuss how the historiography of the China-Burma-India theater of World War II changes over time, but still can obscure a more basic American misunderstanding of Chiang, his government, his military, and his communist rivals during the war. We also review the obstacles that prevented the nationalists and the communists from making common cause in China, which will lead to a resumption of their bitter civil war after World War II ends.
Now we must introduce another major American military figure of the China-Burma-India theater, Claire Chennault, known as Old Leatherface. He already was in China when Stilwell arrived. He had been a United States Army Air Corps officer. Now let's take another terminology break here. The United States Army Air Service became the United States Army Air Corps in 1926, and then it became the United States Army Air Forces in June 1941. And that's what would go on to become the independent U.S. Air Force in 1947, after World War II. There are people who will tell you that the Air Corps still existed in World War II, but it did not. Air Corps in World War II just meant everybody who was an aviator in the Army, just like you could talk about the Tank Corps was everybody in tanks, or Infantry Corps was everybody in infantry. It was no longer an organization at that point. Anyway, Claire Chennault. In the Air Corps, he had been a maverick, he was insubordinate, he was an outspoken proponent of fighter aircraft, even though Army Air Corps doctrine emphasized the role of bombers. So he got passed over for promotion, and he retired in the 1930s from the Army Air Corps. But after retiring, Chennault went to China in 1937 as a private citizen when Chiang Kai-shek hired him on a 3-month contract to assess the Chinese Air Force, because Chiang Kai-shek wanted to have a modern Air Force. Chiang liked Chennault, and Chennault wound up staying in China for 8 years, until almost the end of World War II in 1945.
Chennault was actually more positive, in terms of his outlook and how he presented things to Chiang.
Much.
Personality-wise, they're going to get along a lot better. Mm-hmm. One other thing, and this is probably worth noting, during the 30s, Madam Chiang Kai-shek was actually in charge of the Air Force. And this enabled her to form a very tight relationship with Claire Chennault, in a sense. And to be honest, just given the way the power dynamics, she really is the only person who can talk to Chiang. Everybody else is a subordinate. She is the only person that can actually, and so to have her in your corner, as Chennault definitely did, because of this relationship that they developed, was a key part of the way he was able to influence things.
Yeah, Chennault maintained very warm relations with Chiang Kai-shek throughout, and he was the polar opposite of Vinegar Joe Stilwell.
And Madam Chiang Kai-shek,
And
too.
Madam Chiang Kai-shek, yeah. All right, so Chennault is in China. In 1941, President Roosevelt supported a recruiting effort for volunteer American pilots to fly in the Chinese Air Force. And that resulted in the creation of something called the American Volunteer Group, or AVG, which was a Chinese Air Force unit manned and controlled by Americans. And in late 1941, it was under Chennault's command. The AVG operated the P-40 Warhawk, and that was the United States Army's frontline fighter in 1941. The United States under Lend-Lease provided a large number of these P-40s to the British Royal Air Force, which used them in North Africa. They used a different name for them. They called them Tomahawks. But anyway, the same plane. And the noses of aircraft had been painted with shark's eyes and teeth as early as World War I. And in World War II, some of those British Tomahawks were painted in this way. Teeth along the bottom of the nose, along the air scoop at the bottom, and then some eyes looking right forward where the machine guns aimed. After seeing this, the American Volunteer Group decided to paint their P-40s in the same way. And that marking became iconic for U.S. aircraft in China during World War II. Now, they were painted to look like sharks, but the markings prompted the U.S. press to call the American Volunteer Group the Flying Tigers, because the markings apparently made the press think they were tiger's teeth, not shark's teeth. And the name Flying Tigers was what stuck. So you just got to accept the fact that planes painted like sharks were called tigers. Anyway, some people also thought the markings were supposed to frighten superstitious Japanese pilots by making them think they were under attack by dragons, which I think is complete nonsense. I think we can give the Japanese pilots more credit than that. But a number of things created a mystique for Chennault. I mentioned that Stilwell had a mystique based on his walkout from Burma. We talked about that in the last episode. The mystique around the Flying Tigers was a myth that arose that the Flying Tigers were brave Americans who had fought the Japanese for years before Pearl Harbor. But in fact, they didn't fly their first mission against the Japanese until a week or two after the Pearl Harbor attack. It's true that there were American and other international pilots flying in the Chinese Air Force in the 1930s, but that was not the American Volunteer Group. That was not the Flying Tigers. The American Volunteer Group only existed for a few months. It was incorporated into the U.S. Army Air Forces on July 4th, 1942, as part of something called the China Air Task Force, and in March 1943, it became the U.S. Army Air Force's 14th Air Force. Under whatever designation, it earned the Distinguished Combat Record, and this is another aspect of Chennault's mystique. At a time when the Allies were losing everywhere badly, including in the air, Chennault's forces, the Flying Tigers, were shooting down far more Japanese planes than they lost. And this was an unusual success at a time amongst so much failure. Chennault developed innovative tactics, and without going too far down the air tactics rabbit hole here, the issue was that the kinds of planes the Japanese flew were much more maneuverable than the Allied planes. The Allied planes were heavier, which made them stronger in terms of their structure, but also made them not as good in the turning dogfight. They couldn't maneuver as well. And so a lot of Allied pilots dogfighting with the Japanese got shot down early in the war. Chennault said, well, let's not do that. Let's use our aircraft, our P-40s, in a way that exploits their advantages, which was they had a higher dive speed. They could then use that dive speed to climb back up, zoom up high again. So Chennault had his pilots do just a series of firing passes without doing any dogfighting. Go in, shoot at the Japanese planes, go past them, zoom up, come around again for another firing pass. And this was very successful. And throughout the existence of the Flying Tigers and their successor organizations, you have to give Chennault credit that they always did very well in air-to-air combat against the Japanese at a time when no one else did. So it's true that he was successful that way. So between this mystique of fighting the Japanese when no one else did, which was wrong, and having these cool markings on their planes, which had a catchy name, the Flying Tigers, but also because of his actual achievements as an Air Force commander, Chennault developed quite a mystique, quite a following, which still exists today among people in the United States.
And he is certainly going to be much more agreeable to Chiang Kai-shek with in terms of his attitude towards things like corruption and so forth. He is he's actually quite the hero down in Louisiana. He wasn't actually born in Louisiana, but he spent a lot of time there. And let's just say he had kind of the swaggering Southern rogue to Stilwell's New England Puritan, which the swaggering Southern rogue works a lot better with Chiang Kai-shek and his corrupt administration than does someone who is perpetually judgmental towards it.
Chennault came back into the U.S. Army Air Forces when the American Volunteer Group was incorporated into them. And technically, this made him a subordinate of Stilwell's, because Stilwell commanded all U.S. forces in China. But late in 1942, a new dispute over strategy arose, and this time it was between Stilwell and Chennault. They were at loggerheads in a typical ground forces versus air forces dispute. And those of you who listened to our America First series will remember that we talked at some length about Charles Lindbergh having an aviator's understanding of the world, which wasn't really broad enough to really understand things like armies and navies. Well, that kind of came into play here as well. So Chennault made a claim, and it's an amazing claim, really, when you think about it, that air power alone could play the decisive role in China and do it more cheaply than anything that Stilwell had recommended. He actually said that given about 140 or 150 planes
consistently,
and
he had to always have that number.
Yeah, and by World War II, that sounds like a lot of planes nowadays, I guess, but by World War II standards, that's not a lot of planes for an entire theater of war. Okay, given about 140 or 150 planes, he could defeat the Japanese in China and maybe win the war as a whole against the Japanese. Now, Stilwell argued that this was nonsense, that only a Chinese ground force supplied and modeled along U.S. lines could win the war in China. And besides, if the Chinese army was not reformed, the Japanese could launch a ground offensive and capture Chennault's air bases and knock his air force out of the war. So
there's also a supply element as well.
Well, there's always a supply element,
which I've got to say I don't think Chennault took into account as much as Stilwell did.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Chennault countered Stilwell by saying that the Chinese army was perfectly capable of defending his air bases. Stilwell said a North Burma campaign was necessary to get enough supplies into China, but Chennault said that the over-the-hump airlift was enough, making reopening the Burma Road a waste of resources and time. And when you think about it, Chennault offered a quicker, much less laborious option to decision makers than Stilwell did.
And it's not going to be costing Chiang and his subordinate generals their resources.
Yes, we're going to come to that. So Stimson and Marshall supported Stilwell, as they always did. Unlike Stilwell, Chennault had warm relations with Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chung.
Yes.
And
just imagine First Lady being in charge of the Air Force as well.
And Chiang Kai-shek endorsed Chennault's ideas. Why? Because basically, if Chennault was right, it meant that Chung's army could sit back and watch while Chennault defeated the Japanese.
Which is what they really wanted to do. They really what their strategy for beating the Japanese was to have the other barbarians defeat the Japanese barbarians so that they could save up resources for this upcoming Armageddon-like civil war.
So Chennault's ideas were exactly what Chiang Kai-shek was really looking for. Also supporting Chennault were Joseph Alsop. He was an influential journalist serving on Chennault's staff who wrote glowingly about Chennault.
He's also
he was a cousin. What was his relationship exactly?
He was a cousin of Eleanor.
Okay.
And he would be a cousin of Franklin, but she was the daughter of FDR's brother.
Okay.
And Alsop was the grandson of she was the daughter of Teddy Roosevelt's brother, Elliot, and Joe Alsop was the grandson of one of TR's sisters.
So you didn't know this was a genealogy podcast, but once in a while it is.
Yes.
Okay. So he's related to Roosevelt. He's a distant cousin, at least. He was also good friends with Harry Hopkins, who was Roosevelt's confidant and advisor. Marshall, why don't you tell us what Harry Hopkins' role was and position?
Well, Harry Hopkins gets introduced into the power dynamic of the New Deal actually through Eleanor. And he starts out as a social worker who came out of Iowa, but actually did some work in settlement houses during the 1920s. And this is where he comes on to Eleanor's radar. Gradually, he becomes more and more a friend of FDR's, and in fact, I would say after the death of Louis Howe, his longtime advisor in 1935, Harry Hopkins becomes FDR's best friend. FDR is even thinking about making him his successor in 1940, and he appoints Hopkins after Hopkins has had experience in handling some New Deal relief programs. He appoints him Secretary of Commerce. Unfortunately, Harry Hopkins suffered from stomach cancer and was having difficulty staying alive. He had to subsist on what was largely a liquid diet. But Hopkins ended up moving into the White House as sort of like special advisor to the president kind of like minister without portfolio. And he and Roosevelt would see each other all the time. They'd have their meals together, etc. And Hopkins was as close to Roosevelt's alter ego as one could get.
And at this point, he didn't really have an official government position, right?
No.
Harry Hopkins was kind of like best friend of the United States or something.
Yeah, he basically ran his responsibilities out of a back room in the White House on a card table.
Right.
But
so confidant and advisor to Roosevelt.
Yes.
So you had Stimson, Marshall, and Stilwell on one side. You had Chiang Kai-shek, Harry Hopkins, Joseph Alsop on the other side. And Roosevelt says, well, come in and give me presentations to advocating each position. So Stilwell and Chennault get called to Washington, and they give presentations to Roosevelt. Now, Stilwell is so uncomfortable giving it that at one point FDR asked him if he was ill.
Well, Chennault actually went first.
But Chennault gave a polished, whichever. But Chennault gave a polished presentation. And so Chennault won the argument because the presentation was so much better than Chennault's.
Stilwell wasn't expecting to have to compete at that level.
Yeah.
Plus
it was diplomacy and tact, and he wasn't good at those kind of things. He hated to deal with politicians and try to explain things to them. So there was all that going on in that dynamic. At any rate, Chennault's idea carried the day. So now this resulted in endless tension over supplying Chennault, because remember that Stilwell controlled the supplies, and that had not changed for the theater. Stilwell wanted to devote them to Burma and to reforming the Chinese army, but Chennault wanted them for the 14th Air Force. Now, again, we have to admit that Chennault achieved notable successes in his air campaign in terms of the number of planes shot down, the number of targets they bombed, the number of ships sunk. And in that regard, and this is pretty much true throughout his career in China, Burma, India, he commanded one of the more successful efforts in that theater. There's no way around that. But he had vastly overpromised, because victory over the Japanese remained elusive during 1943 and even into a second campaign he tried to launch in 1944.
And you can't control territory with aircraft.
And it's this thing that we discussed in the America's First series, that air power advocates are very good at technology and at targeting and, well, things like air tactics, right? Because that's what they do for a living. They're not that good, though, at applying that in a strategic sense to what's going on in the ground and on the water and those types of things. They don't seem to really take that into account very much. There's sort of an assumption that as long as we bomb enough stuff and shoot enough stuff down, we'll win. We will win the war. But how exactly is often not really explained. Well, they did not win the war. Meanwhile, Stilwell and the British finally had begun their campaign in northern Burma. This is around the beginning of 1944. You will remember that in the last episode, we discussed how Stilwell had been advocating this campaign in North Burma since the middle of 1942. Unlike Chennault, who wasn't really getting results, the campaign in Burma made a clear difference on the ground. Stilwell went into Burma, and remember I told you about Merrill's Marauders. He took command of them in the field, in the jungles and mountains of Burma. He used them as a regular infantry force rather than as a commando force, and in tough fighting cleared the path for the Lido Road and captured a key Japanese air base, which in turn made the over-the-hump air route safer from Japanese interception by Japanese fighters, and it also allowed planes on that route to take a more direct and efficient path so they could carry more. I'm referring to a number of things we discussed in the last episode, in which we described the over-the-hump airlift from India to China, the Allies beginning the construction of the Lido Road, which was a new road to replace the Burma Road, and create a new overland route through northern Burma to supply China, and also how Stilwell and U.S. Army logistics planners viewed the opening of the Lido Road as the key to delivering supplies and equipment to China, necessary for reforming the nationalist Chinese forces, and how, therefore, a campaign to retake northern Burma and open a route for the Ledo Road was a necessary precursor to Allied victory over the Japanese in China. So this victorious campaign in Burma in 1944 was a great step forward for Stilwell and his plans. This success in Burma contrasted with Chennault's failure to break the stalemate with Japan and China. Other things broke Stilwell's way, too. Frustrated with Chung's demands and failure to take the offensive, FDR in 1944 began to adopt Stilwell's quid pro quo approach toward Chung. This is another thing we talked about in the last episode. Stilwell believed that the only way to get Chiang Kai-shek to reform his government by stopping all of the corruption, or to reform his army, or to take offensive action against the Japanese in China, was to provide him with Lend-Lease supplies on a quid pro quo basis, under which Chung would receive aid only to the extent that he met U.S. demands for reform and offensive action. It contrasted with a softer approach to dealing with Chung, which Roosevelt had adopted in 1943, which held that Chung would eventually do what the United States wanted, if given time, and not faced with too much pressure. Roosevelt's shift to the quid pro quo approach had at least some limited success in nudging China into action, and nudging Chung into action, I should say. He launched an offensive at one point which did not succeed, but at least Chung did something for once after years of sitting back and doing little or nothing against the Japanese. In April 1944, the Japanese, as Stilwell had predicted, began something called Operation Ichigo. I looked it up. I thought that was something like cool name, like Victory Now or something. It turns out it just means number one. So, oh well. But anyway, the Japanese began Operation Ichigo. That was a major offensive to capture the 14th Air Force's bases. And it also wound up threatening the bases from which the Army Air Force's new B-29 Superfortress bombers had begun a strategic bombing campaign against Japan. For those who don't know, the B-29 is, the Enola Gay that dropped the atomic bomb on Japan was a B-29. Also, as Stilwell had predicted, the Chinese army proved incapable of stopping the Japanese. And by the time Ichigo ended in December 1944, the Japanese had captured much of southern China, which was the first major change in the front lines in China since 1939. This all culminated in an ultimatum to Chiang Kai-shek from Roosevelt, demanding that Stilwell be given command of Chung's army in September 1944. But when Chung rejected the ultimatum and instead demanded that Stilwell be relieved, FDR, who did not want to lose China, gave in, and Stilwell was recalled to the United States in October 1944. Trucks began using the Ledo Road in January 1945, and by the end of the war in August 1945, they had delivered thousands of tons of supplies to Chongqing. In early 1945, the Ledo Road was renamed the Stilwell Road in honor of Joseph Stilwell, at the suggestion of Chiang Kai-shek, of all people. So perhaps there was some respect there after all. But Chennault advocates point out that the airlift succeeded in delivering 7 times as much per month as the trucks ever did, which they think vindicates Chennault's view that Stilwell's campaign in North Burma and the construction of the Ledo Road were unnecessary. Chennault remained in China until July 1945 before he also was recalled. The Chinese had some success in offensive ground operations in China during 1945, but in the end, the Japanese were defeated in Burma and the Pacific, but not in China, where they controlled significant territory until their troops withdrew after the end of World War II in August 1945. So in researching all of this, I found a number of things about the historiography that we should point out, and I think to some extent it clouds everyone's vision about what was going on in China. So, what I mean by that is, a lot of the historiography winds up focusing on the dispute between Stilwell and Chiang Kai-shek, and for good reason, because that was a driving force in what happened in CBI during the war. Others support and defend Stilwell and Chennault in their argument against each other, which is the United States having an argument with itself rather than really discussing China. My understanding is the received historiography up until the 1990s just focused on the idea that Chennault's successes were not in and of themselves decisive, fair enough, and that Stilwell was right all along. It's kind of the way this comes across, that if we just done what Stilwell said, maybe that would have worked.
Well, you'd also have to have Chiang Kai-shek go along with what
Well,
Stilwell
that's
said.
What I'm getting.
Yeah.
That's what I'm getting to, though, is that it focuses too much on whether Stilwell or Chennault were right. But all that really mattered was, what did Chiang Kai-shek want to do? He wanted to do the thing that would allow him to expend the fewest resources and get the Japanese out without really having to fight them at all.
And have the U.S. U.S. and British do most of the heavy lifting.
So, but we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, because what I wanted to say was that that's kind of the what's the right word? The traditional historiography.
Yeah.
That's what the U.S. Army official history of World War II. That's what it conveys in its 3 volumes on CBI. And my understanding is the Barbara Tuchman book also generally takes that tone. I saw one person saying that, it was actually kind of a critique of Tuchman's book, where there was someone saying Tuchman's book was a very good book that reflected the thinking up until the early 1990s, the consensus, the historiographical consensus. But since the 1990s, a different historiography, a different way of looking at this has cropped up. One idea is that maybe Tuchman was too heavily influenced by Stilwell's diaries, which of course make him sound good because it's his diary.
Well, also,
and the Army official history is a ground forces history, right? And Chennault had been an Air Force guy, so the Air Force official history is going to talk about how great Chennault was, but the Army history is going to focus more on the ground campaign and the ground aspect. So you're going to get a biased view from those two sources. That's what the new historiography is saying.
I would add to that is that Tuchman's book is published in 1971, and it reflects a kind of Vietnam-era mentality. So Vietnam-era mentality is related to nation building and trying to set up U.S. similar institutions and ways of doing things and procedures in countries which have no experience with those kinds of things. And this was something that underpinned a lot of the assumptions we made when going into South Vietnam. Ultimately, comes down on the fact she will present Stilwell, and she will draw heavily on the diaries. She does not think, though, that Stilwell was the ideal person for the job. She is not. There is not. I mean, she does view him heroically, but
he was not.
He was not. But she ultimately, that is her opinion. That is her take on this. That she thinks Stilwell is a great guy and everything, but he is not the guy who should have been given this job.
Yeah. And
so, in that sense, I would say that even though the historiography might have moved on, I still see a lot of value in this book, because she actually takes into account the context that Stilwell is operating under, and basically saying that Stilwell is kind of, in a sort of Don Quixote type role, tilting at windmills here.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And trying to swim upstream against all of this corruption, all of these issues. And it's kind of surprising, though, what's really interesting with this whole thing, it's not like Stilwell just got dropped into China all by himself. Stilwell should have known better in some respects, because Stilwell's experience goes back to 1911. He was also the military attaché in terms of dealing with this. And so he should have had a better sense of what he was dealing with. He certainly knew that he wanted to reform it, but he didn't quite seem to grasp the power dynamics, which you would think he would be able to do.
Well, he did something that Americans tend to do. Americans tend to assume that everybody out there is trying to be Americans.
That's their aspiration.
Their aspiration is to be like us. And the fact that they're not there yet usually means like their government is corrupt or something is wrong like that. But they want to be like us.
Well,
so he goes out and he looks at the nationalist government and he says, well, they're all corrupt. You're not going to get the best results out of them. The communists are these good agrarian reformers, democratically inclined. Maybe they would do it. But fundamentally underneath all of that is an idea that China is an America waiting to happen.
Well,
and Americans do that over and over again all the time, because we've been trying to export our revolution around the world since 1776. And here we go again. We're always looking for the George Washington of that country who's going to lead them up and make them into a country just like ours. And I think that in Stilwell's case, that might explain why he overlooked all these things like you're talking about, like he should have known better, because it's a deep emotional thing that a lot of Americans have, that everybody wants to be like us.
Well, Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang Kai-shek And I mean, this is where, where I emphasized the Sung family before. They are a product of, U.S. Methodist education. I mean, this education gave them a very good understanding of who they were dealing with when they dealt with the United States. Madame Chiang Kai-shek spoke English fluently. She was actually Chiang Kai-shek's interpreter, as well as being in charge of the Air Force. But she was actually a fairly influential figure. She got to stay over at the White House whenever she'd come, an honor only Winston Churchill would have been given at that point.
They, the Sungs.
Yes, the Sungs. They knew what they were dealing with. They understood what U.S. aspirations were. When influential Americans visited China, say when Henry Luce came through.
Henry Luce, remember, the publisher we discussed a couple of episodes ago.
Chiang and Madame Chiang and the Song family would present them with a whole dog and pony show, telling them how the nationalist government was modernizing and Christianizing China. And this is ridiculous when you think about it. There is no democratic tradition in China. There are no democratic institutions in China. And the literacy rate is only 20% of the population at best. 80% of it is illiterate.
It's illiterate. Yeah.
It's illiterate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like you cannot have democratic government cannot be imposed from on high, which is a mistake we continually make, not just in China, but other parts of the world. Although I think China, the reason I wanted us to do China is because I feel like China is a perfect example of things that we continue to do and do over again in a wrong-headed fashion, which, this is part of the whole Vietnam heritage. At the same time, Barbara Tuchman was writing her book about Stilwell. There was criticism in the United States about what we were doing in South Vietnam during the Vietnam War, which was seen to be a repeat of all the mistakes we had made in China regarding nation building.
Yeah, because that was a nation-building event
yes,
in
it's
South
more
Vietnam.
nation-building, yes.
It's all kind of nation-building. Now, in China, I don't think you can say that we were really trying to engage in nation-building there. But what we were trying to do is give this nation an army that would fight well or defeat the Japanese for this nation without really taking into account how this nation wasn't what we thought it was at all.
And also, we're promoting democracy, which is what Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Chiang Kai-shek are saying. They claim to be doing that.
We claim that this is where
they're not there yet, but this is their goal.
Yeah.
And there's also, and you cannot emphasize this too much, there's also the religious aspect of this where both Chiang and Madame Chiang are Christians in a country that is, and they're going to go and Christianize China, and then we're going to get like the second coming of the Lord and all of that kind of stuff too. Let's talk about the communists, because I would say that the communists are also playing this game as well.
This gets into another big misunderstanding.
Yes.
Which Stilwell and those China hands I referred to got wrong. The impression, and you'll still hear this from people today, was that the communists actually did most of the fighting. They really fought the Japanese hard. In 1941, they did have an offensive they launched, so it's not like they never fought the Japanese because they did it. At least they had one big offensive. They did engage in a lot of guerrilla warfare against Japanese forces.
Political organizing.
They did do that. But how much did they really do? If you listen to Stilwell, you'll hear that, well, they did all the fighting, and the nationalists did virtually none. Now, Chennault advocates would tell you, because I saw one say this in one of his articles, that the nationalists actually suffered 600,000 casualties during the time when the front line was frozen between 1938 and 1944. Now, they don't break down how many of those casualties were due to combat with the Japanese, how many were just illness, because China had no medical service in its army. When you were sick, you were just sick on your own.
You died.
It doesn't break all that down. Surely they were doing some fighting. And in fact, even though the front lines were frozen, you did have combat happen. And kind of the way it played out was once in a while the Japanese would decide to try their hand at fighting the Chinese just to kind of keep in practice, and they'd launch a small offensive. What the Chinese would tend to do, the nationalists would tend to fall back, let them take the territory, do a little bit of shooting.
Then the Japanese would pull back to more or less their original lines because they could not or did not want to hold the territory they had captured. And then the nationalist Chinese would move back into the area the Japanese had withdrawn from, and things would settle back into a stalemate again.
So there was kind of this thing where there was fighting, there was some give and take going on. Nothing major was happening in terms of changing the lines on the map. So yes, there was fighting. Yes, the nationalists no doubt suffered some casualties during that fighting. Maybe there were several 100,000. I don't really know.
Well, one of the critical things to look at is where is the main level of effort on the part of the Japanese? If we go through and just follow this notion that, it's the communists that are doing most of the fighting, then you would expect to see a major level of effort directed against the Chinese communists, but that is not the case. The major level of effort is directed against the nationalists. And the Chinese communists are doing their thing, and they are trying to say the right things to they surely know how frustrating it is to deal with Chiang Kai-shek, and they surely know what the right things are to say to State Department, political officers, and so forth, and, communicate with General Stilwell. I mean, when you're dealing with someone like Zhou Enlai, and Zhou Enlai was probably the most positive member of the Communist Party in terms of being able to communicate with Westerners and on an international level, very appealing, even appealing now within China.
He knew how to play Americans.
And I would argue that what you have is Americans coming in with the best of intentions, and you have the communists and you have the nationalists basically attempting to gain some sort of advantage to take advantage of U.S. biases in these cases. And I think that's actually close to the truth. And I mean, like with the China hands, which we'll get into in the next episode, they are perceived as being martyrs. And to a certain extent, that is correct. They were right about how ineffective Chiang's government was.
And in the United States, they were blamed for being pro-communist elements of the U.S. government who lost China, at least according to pro-Chiang elements within the United States.
We're going to get into the details of that next time.
Yes, but the point is, Chiang was not as competent as he was portrayed. And this is where you get the shock for having lost China.
So here's the thing: the newer historiography doesn't excuse Chiang Kai-shek. It doesn't ennoble him or make him a hero or anything. But it does tend to say that to just focus on Chiang Kai-shek was corrupt, wouldn't listen to Stilwell, and was just saving up his Lend-Lease aid to use against the communists someday, right? That's only like half the story. In other words, if you're Chiang Kai-shek, though, what else would you do?
You're operating within the system that you have.
You had a system, and we talked about this earlier, where you had to have corruption for people to get paid enough. You had to distribute aid among people, just among other generals, just to make them stay on your side. You had to refrain from using that stuff in combat, because if you used it in combat, you might wind up empowering one of the other generals. You might wind up losing the equipment that you were trying to save up. So it's an idea that doesn't excuse Chiang Kai-shek, but it's more along the lines of...
It explains it.
What were the Americans thinking? Why did they realize that this would have been the case, that this is what Chiang Kai-shek was going to do?
They're not understanding the system.
They're not understanding the system. And it's layer upon layer of these things. So like Stilwell's attitude about the communists, for example, right? We were talking about that. They were focused on prepping for fighting with the nationalists.
Oh, yeah.
They were. They weren't doing most of the fighting against the Japanese. I don't really know where these figures come from, to be honest with you. I do know I saw them in an article, so take this with a grain of salt. But I did see an article that said that the evidence is that the communists between 1937 and 1939, which was the time of the major early Japanese military operations, really only suffered about 2 to 3% of the casualties the Chinese suffered. All the other ones were nationalist losses.
Well, if you think about how the two sides are fighting, there's much more conventional force-on-force fighting with the nationalists.
The communists were engaged in guerrilla warfare and things, right? So, of course, you're going to have lower casualties.
They're doing hit and goes.
But the thing about it is, they weren't doing most of the fighting.
No, they're not.
They're not supermen who don't die when you shoot them. If you only suffer 2 to 3% of the casualties, you couldn't possibly be doing all that much of the fighting, is kind of the counter-argument. And in fact, I think it was Mao. Mao sent a secret directive out to his commanders and his leaders, and he said during the war with the Japanese, our focus is 70% on expansion, 20% on dealing with the nationalists, and only 10% on fighting the Japanese.
Yes.
So their focus was not fighting the Japanese.
Yeah.
They and the nationalists are circling around each other doing the same thing, getting ready for the war that was to come after the Japanese left someday. And from their perspective, even though Americans might hate to hear it, it makes sense if you look at it from their perspective.
Yes.
That makes a lot of sense. Why should I get all beat up when I can rely on other people to go beat the enemy up for me?
And this is a Chinese...
And he'll leave, and then I can fight my real enemy.
Barbarians fighting barbarians.
Yeah.
Use the barbarians to fight the other barbarians.
So we have to consider all of that, I think. And when I look at it, it's not like the original historiography in the Army Official History and Barbara Tuchman's book. And so people know what we're talking about. We're talking about Barbara Tuchman's Stilwell and the American Experience in China.
Winner of the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1972.
In 1972, published in 71.
Yeah.
Correct? Yeah, right. So that's the book we're talking about. Those books aren't wrong, but they may not be including all these other elements you have to consider, which doesn't excuse Chiang Kai-shek, but it explains him better. And also, in my opinion, from doing the research, so many people are focused on who was right, Stilwell or Chennault. Should we have done quid pro quos or gone easier on Chiang Kai-shek? Should we have opened the Burma Road, or should we have focused on Chennault with the 14th Air Force? Should we have done those things? But like I said before, those are Americans arguing with themselves about how to beat the Japanese in China. It isn't a discussion of how we're going to be, or what China's goals are, what China's trying to achieve.
And how effective we can be with China.
And how effective we can be with China. And in fact, I had a thought, and I didn't read this anywhere. It's just me, and maybe I'm dumb to bring it up. But one of the thoughts I had after looking at all of this was, let's do a counterfactual. What if there had been no communist movement in China? What if it was the nationalists, and they had all their issues with warlords, fighting warlords and trying to, put together some kind of government under Chung or whoever else? What if they were doing all that, and then the Japanese invaded, and the Japanese had the success that they wound up having, and then we enter World War II, and we want to defeat the Japanese, and we're dealing with a Chiang Kai-shek who has no communist insurgency to prepare for in the future. You with me?
Yes.
He doesn't have that. Would Chiang Kai-shek have behaved any differently in that scenario?
No, because the warlords would have occupied the same niche as the communists.
So
did.
Almost in a way, I guess what I'm trying to say here is, almost in a way, by focusing so much on how Chiang Kai-shek was saving up his resources to fight the communists, that's true, but it almost misses another point, an even deeper point.
Whether communists existed in China or not, Chiang Kai-shek would still have had warlords to deal with and would still have behaved the same way. And this leads me to that deeper point,
which is that you're dealing with the army of almost like a feudal system, a feudal kind of an army, with a bunch of different liege lords who have mixed loyalties to each other. And it's not a national army fighting for a Chinese national state in the way everybody on our side was. FDR, Lachlan Curry, Stilwell, Chennault, you name them, anybody, right? All of us on the U.S. side of this, we're making a false assumption that this is a national government with a national army, which had as its goal liberating China from the Japanese. Because that's how we would think, and that's what we would do.
Yes, and that is completely not their goal. And again, we're giving Chiang, during the time, we're giving Chiang far more credit for being, say, a co-equal with, say, Churchill. They are not the same.
Well, that's because Roosevelt wanted to have them be one of the four policemen. So we had to have Chiang Kai-shek seen as like Churchill.
Well, I would argue that...
as a political matter.
That people did portray the government, the nationalist government, as being in charge. Mm-hmm. When it's just, it controls, it is one of a group of a series of contending forces within China.
It really only directly controlled about a quarter of China.
Yeah. Throughout its entire, because you've got warlords, you have communists. So Chiang never, ever consolidates power and is able to rule and initiate all these reforms that he keeps saying he's going to do someday when it's convenient. And this is for, say, U.S. correspondents and others.
But was he really going to carry out those reforms? Or was he just saying that to play us?
I think there were certain reforms that they did want to enact.
Okay.
And they were constantly coming up with slogans for this. But in terms of turning China into a democracy, hell no. That's not going to happen. If Chiang's, Sun Yat-sen may have liked people like Washington and Lincoln, Chiang idealized Hitler and the Nazis. In fact, Stilwell just basically thought that, he was constantly griping in his diary about how Chiang was just a Chinese version of Hitler, and why are we fighting alongside this creep here?
The bottom line for me is Chiang Kai-shek was playing us. But he was playing us for reasons that make sense from his perspective. And in a way, maybe we shouldn't have expected anything else. And we should have handled him in that way. And in a way, maybe all these arguments about Stilwell versus Chennault, or, quid pro quo versus being nicer to, easier on Chiang Kai-shek, and should we have reformed the Chinese army or not, and all these kind of things. Maybe they missed just the broader point that Chiang was going to play us no matter what, that it makes sense for him to do that, and that we went in with all these ideas that were completely false about what the China was that we were really dealing with.
And I would argue that this is a mistake. We did not learn the lesson that we should have learned, and that is that local politicians are going to try to tell us what we want to hear. And we keep seeing this happen over and over and over again. If we want to just look at this, look at what's happening in China, and think about, the lead up to the war with Iraq, and how we were basically going to have a democratic Iraq, and we were going to have all of these wonderful things that were going to develop.
And be seen as liberators. I remember that one.
And yes, and it's kind of like, always be suspicious, I would say to anybody who's listening to this, always be suspicious whenever somebody comes up with that kind of rationale. Also, that wars will pay for themselves. That's another load of bullshit that people like to put out there. One thing I would like to also talk about, because this is something that we see with people who tended to look favorably upon the communists and Chiang Kai-shek. Even though Chiang Kai-shek, has this sort of like idealization of Hitler, making him kind of almost a bad guy here, as far as history goes, Chiang's body count, even though he's in power for about something like 22 years, 1927 to 49. His body count's around 20 million, which is huge. But then let's look at what the communists managed to accomplish. Mao is probably the dictator who has the most blood on his hands in human history. 80 million people die.
No, this is off in the future.
This is off in the future.
During World War II, no.
This is beyond World War II. Yeah. This is during when the communists are running government. So right. The reason I'm putting this out there is, if we're going to look at who, there is this sense that somehow the communists are agrarian reformers and they're somehow more moral than Chiang Kai-shek's government. Is this really the case? Does history support this when they get into power? No. Some of this is due to incompetency, but others are due to just Mao's general bloody-mindedness. So the idea that somehow or the other perceiving Chiang to be the bad guy and the communists to be somehow on the side of the angels because they want to take on the Japanese, when they actually do exercise power, they are far crueler than anything Chiang Kai-shek came up with. There are famines that happen during Chiang's time, but there are man-made famines that happen under Mao's regime there.
Yeah, well, how many people died in the Cultural Revolution?
Yeah.
Later on, how many tens
or
of
the
millions?
Great Leap Forward, where basically China deindustrializes. So going into these things, looking for good guys, looking for guys with white hats who are going to like come in and fulfill some sort of vision for the future of the U.S., that is a problem that we keep doing again and again and again. And I think that this is, you're looking for something that really isn't there. And we see it happening over and over.
Okay, I'm going to zoom back out just slightly, and you all may have covered some of this, but I don't have a great 360-degree view of the inner workings, the conflicts between the communists and Chiang Kai-shek's government that went on for decades, it sounds like.
Well, originally, during the 20s, as Chiang is attempting to rise up in the world and take over the leadership position for his old mentor, Sun Yat-sen, he was actually working with the communists. The communists were part of his group that was trying to sort of bring everybody under his government and his rule. So you have at the military academy that kind of like Chiang used to turn out the Whampoa Academy that was actually helped out by the Comintern, by the Russians, sending Russian experts down to teach. Chiang has as his political officer there Zhou Enlai, and Zhou Enlai is becomes the number two person under Mao, and he's considered the public face that everyone wants to deal with. He's foreign minister. He deals with Kissinger during the whole attempts to bring Nixon over there for Nixon's visit to China and normalization of relations. So at one point, Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, or the Nationalist Party, they are working hand in glove with the communists. Then, in 1927, in Shanghai, because Chiang starts getting all sorts of support for people who are most definitely not communist, bankers, industrialists, etc., Chiang breaks with the communists in a real bloody-minded way and massacres and decimates the entire urban population of the Chinese Communist Party. He goes after them, and in the book by Andre Malraux that deals with this particular episode in Chinese history, Man's Fate, Chiang is going around and he's rounding people up, he's throwing them into incinerators and killing them. You know, he's not even shooting them, he's burning them to death. So it's a pretty cruel and bloody-minded way of going about breaking with the Chinese communists.
And what prompted him to start doing this exactly? What was the thing that caused him to do this right at that time?
He is starting to get support from leading capitalist forces who are fearful of...
No, I understand that, but what I'm asking is why right then in 1927? What triggered him to do this?
He was all of a sudden getting money from them, and and in exchange, they wanted him to break with the communists.
Did they say, could you please kill all of them?
Yes.
Or was that his idea?
That was sort of a string that was attached to the sport.
Okay, gotcha. All right.
You know, there's foreigners that are involved as well. There's a great deal of distrust by people of the affluent classes towards some of the goals of the Chinese communist. And so they said, hey, if you want support from us, and Chiang was kind of running things on a shoestring there. If you want support from us, you're going to have to break with them. And he had no problem with this. But this is why a lot of the leading forces, a lot of leading members in the Chinese communists were from the rural part, where we're talking the peasants. This is where Mao was from. Mao was not part of this sort of urban communist elite. That was basically rounded up and rolled up in the period of 1927. This left a lot of bad blood, as you might expect, between Chiang's nationalist and also the communist. So they retreated to the countryside. They they kind of broke off. You would have people from the urban environment kind of leaving that environment and going off to the countryside, which is where the Chinese communists chose to operate. So after 27, there was no cooperation, really, and a lot of suspicion because of the choices that Chiang had made during that period.
There were occasional initiatives where they would shake hands or
Popular
toast each
Front
other
stuff.
or Popular Front stuff. When the Japanese invaded, you're being attacked by the Japanese. There was an idea of we're allied as a united front against the Japanese, but that was more in name only, because that didn't create some kind of big national feeling of we're all on the same side together by any stretch. It was like, okay, the Japanese are here, and we're still having our fight with each other, but we have to maintain our power base, for after the Japanese are gone. And a lot of it was motivated by things like that, not by true cooperation, against the Japanese.
Or a national idea.
I was
of
just going to say,
China.
it doesn't sound like they had a terrible, great idea of nationalism as
No.
as a complete country.
I mean, there was kind of like there was a vision that Chiang.
Yeah, I think the nationalists and the communists both wanted to unite all of China.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they wanted to do that. So, in the sense of their having a nationalism, a blood and soil nationalism, right? This should be China. One government should control all of it, right? I think they both shared that. They disagree on which one of them it should be. So, but was it, were they willing to make sacrifices with regard to the other in order to achieve that goal? No. And the answer is no. They would rather fight each other than fight even somebody like the Japanese coming and taking over half the country.
Well, there's a lot of bad blood here.
Yeah,
There's a whole
yeah.
history of bad blood. There are occasions during the 30s, the events that preceded Mao's Long March, where the Chinese communists are nearly exterminated by Chiang Kai-shek. So it's not like he was totally incompetent with dealing with that particular adversary. He had done enough to kind of prevent, the kind of things that, say, Stilwell and some of the China hands were advocating are kind of silly. It would be kind of like, in our own case, during the American Revolution, if, say, somebody like the Marquis de Lafayette came up to Washington and said, these Tories, they're not so bad. You ought to form like a common government with them and a united front against the British with the Tories. And bring them into your government and bring them into your military. And Washington would have, had a fit over that. And there is too much hostility between the two sides here to think for one moment that they could cooperate in a sort of national government after the Japanese leave.
But see, that goes back to what we were talking about, which is this fundamental misunderstanding.
Yes.
The idea that the issue here is for China to defeat the Japanese.
Yes.
That's the thing. All of China working together to defeat the Japanese. And that was not what either side had as its goal.
Ultimately,
Not at
no.
all. Ultimately, they wanted someone else to defeat the Japanese, so then they could fight each other, and so that one of them could take over China. That's very different from saying, you know what? Let's bury the hatchet. Let's get the Japanese out of here, and then we'll have established bonds of camaraderie, and we're all Chinese here together, and then let's form a government together, and some of us will be communists, some of us will be nationalists, and we'll have a parliament and we'll vote. That wasn't their goal. That's in a very American way of thinking about things, I guess.
Well,
but that was not the goal of either side.
Think about the British at this point. All right, so you have Churchill, who's Tory, but you also have various members of the Labour Party involved in the government. And that's kind of how we're thinking this could kind of shake out here. But this is things are not going to work that way. You do not have that veneer of civilization that is going to make sure and ensure that everybody plays by Marquis of Queensberry rules here.
Yeah, the Chinese Communist Party is not Labor, not the Labor Party.
No, they're not.
And the Nationalist Party is not the British Conservative, the Tories.
Yes.
They're not that.
They're actually more extreme versions of both.
Maybe more.
In a sort of right-left.
Very extreme. Yeah.
You don't really have a middle ground here.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, if you're going to look for something to indicate democracy is possible, you can't really cobble together democracy when everybody's taking these extreme positions here.
The end of World War II did not bring about an end to conflict in China. Instead, it brought about a resumption of the Chinese Civil War, and indeed the decisive phase of that war. This opened new opportunities and challenges for U.S. engagement in China, and also for new misunderstandings. We will get into all of that in the next episode. That's it for this episode of the United States of Amnesia. Thank you for listening. We hope you learned something, and we hope you discovered new ways of looking at things you had already heard or thought about, or perhaps hadn't heard about. If you enjoyed it, that's great. If we made you mad, that's okay too. Either way, email us at usa.amnesia@gmail.com and let us know what you think. Also, let us know about anything you think we missed or got wrong. We'd like to know about that too. And of course, please like and subscribe and let your friends and neighbors know about us. We also have a website. It's www.usofamnesia.com. For Marshall, Mike, and myself, Blake Hinke. Till next time.